You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're still making our way through, what are we, Samuel? 2 Samuel?
Yeah, 2 Samuel. We're going to be here for a while.
Oh yeah, well, no doubt. I mean, we took us a long while to get through 1 Samuel.
I was looking at my notes when I packed them up. I've got like that many, and it's just they're continuing to grow.
It's about 4 inches for those who aren't seeing things through YouTube.
So yeah, there's just so much to track down and decide whether or not you're going to include this little bit or that little bit.
Yeah,
So
well, the good news is we're not really on a time crunch here.
this is what I like about doing the podcast above teaching for a college class because
Right, yeah, you've only got one semester.
yeah, 16 weeks is not enough time to cover any book of the Bible. And a lot of times they wanted you to do like Old Testament lit. I can't even do Genesis in 16 weeks.
You might be able to cover the genres.
Pretty
like,
much.
That's basically it.
Yeah. And so that is the one nice thing about, well, there's lots of nice things about the podcast over teaching in a classroom. The only thing is you don't get to see who you're talking to. That's the only thing I don't like about podcasting, because it is a lot of fun to just, watch a student or a classroom of people, their eyes light up, and you don't get that payoff. So that being said, y'all get, the listeners can send us comments and stuff. That's about as close as we're going to get.
Yeah,
so
that being said, send us comments. Let us know what you think, how things are going. So, but into the Bible. Let's
the
do
Bible.
that.
Yeah.
We left at the end of chapter 3. David had just embarrassed Joab.
Yeah.
For killing Abner.
Yeah, and had allowed Joab to remain alive and was going to still make total use of Joab's abilities because he was a good general. And Joab's going to be very
except
important.
for the murder thing, I guess he was okay, right?
Well, if you're a general at that point in time, murder might just be part of the job description.
Possible,
So,
yeah.
A little bit looser idea on what was proper when it came to defending your country back then. Not as many courts and laws to have to deal with. So, yeah. Right. So Abner, he's gone. He's dead. He had already brokered that tentative agreement between the tribes. And so now the only thing between David and the throne is Ishbosheth. And David had made no move to remove Saul and his sons from power before. He was content to wait and see what happens. And the same is going to be true of Ishbosheth. And but it seems like the people aren't content to wait. So we're going to get into the story of how Ishbosheth gets taken out of the picture. So verse 1. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard Abner died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all of Israel was dismayed. So, nice little pithy description of the attitudes. But the Septuagint, I thought was interesting. They're the only ones that add the names. In the Masoretic, it doesn't add Ishbosheth's name. It's just Saul's son. They don't even care enough about who he is as a person because he's not important as a person. Everything he's done while he's been reigning has not contributed anything to the nation's well-being or, helping further the mission of the king along. The only reason why he's there is because he's Saul's son. So as for courage failed, their courage failed. This is one reason why I love the Hebrew is because it's very picturesque, and it's literally his hands sank. I'm sorry, it's referring to Ishbosheth specifically, and so it gives us this idea that he's just so overwhelmed. He can't even raise his hands to do anything. And we're going to see actually in one of the Psalms we're going to go through later, where David talks about God and says, his hands are high, his right hand is high. And this idea of having high hands is strength, but when your hands fall, then you're just weak and helpless. And it, kind of gives you the idea that he's losing his grip on power and courage. So when we think about why this was, because Ishbosheth and Abner had not parted on good terms, so they really seemed to part on very hostile terms. you have to wonder why the death of Abner wasn't a comfort to him, because now essentially this threat to his throne had been removed.
Mhm.
But you kind of get this idea, if it's going to bother him, then maybe he had hoped for reconciliation. Maybe he thought he could still count on Abner's protection. And, he may have even thought that this was David's first strike against him. And he may not have understood that David had nothing to do with it. He just knew his general was dead after going to Hebron.
Sure.
So it makes sense. Now, all of Israel was dismayed. Sometimes the ESV is kind of a little restrained in the way it presents
Right.
presents ideas. It's more of they were shocked. They were terrified. Dismayed just sounds like, somebody spilt something on the rug and upset them, but
Yeah, the JPS says alarmed. So that's
alarmed is
a
closer.
little-
Yeah. And, they could believe that at this point it was very plausible that their oppression as a nation was the result of not having a strong leader. And we see that, like, when the judges, during the era of the judges, whenever the other nations came in and oppressed Israel, this idea of having a strong leader to rise up and protect them was very much at the heart of the nation's desires. And this is why they had asked for a king, was to get that strong leader for defense. And so the people knew Abner was the strong leader and he was the defender, not Ishbosheth. And so his death on its own would have been terrifying enough, but his death specifically at Hebron would have made it seem like David had been the one who orchestrated this. So we're told in verse 337, the chapter we went through last week, that, all the people appreciated the fact that David had warned. But we need to remember, again, when you're looking at the biblical use of the word all, we're talking about everyone present and everyone who is impacted in that moment.
Sure.
So to get the news from Hebron back to Ishbosheth, there's no telling how long that took and what details kind of filtered through. I mean, we all know what it's like to get information that's kind of spotty and, this person says that. And so for him to get the full story would have taken some time. And that all in 337 would not have meant that all of Israel appreciated what David did, or that all of Israel felt comforted and approving of David's mourning over Abner's death. It just meant those there. And so now Ishbosheth has to be brought into that truth. And so this idea of fear is very central to Ishbosheth's death, because his death illustrates how fearful the people had to be of the situation to want it rectified, and how far they were willing to go to change this kind of limbo that they were in as a nation. So,
well, and this is also interesting. I know I've mentioned this. I can't remember when I mentioned it before, but in Matthew 2, where the wise men tell Herod about the new king of the Jews, and it says Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And it's kind of interesting. You have this new king coming on the scene, and everyone's bothered by it.
Well, we can look at modern day illustrations today. We just had an election. We just have a new president. And this is not a comment on anybody's politics, but just that transition.
Well, every time there's a new president, everyone has fears about the economy, about
justified or not. It's something that is true, because we don't know what that new leader is going to mean.
Right.
And so when you've got someone who can affect your livelihood, and a king definitely could, because you got to remember, a king didn't have a constitution to hold back power.
Right.
So this guy could come into your home and take everything. He could, take your sons for soldiers, your daughters for sex slaves. The king had absolute power within his rule. So a new king was 10 times or 100 times more frightening than anything we've experienced in our lifetime with this transition of power.
Right.
So, verse 2. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of the raiding bands. The names of one was Baanah, and the name of the other was Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, a man of Benjamin from Beeroth. The Beerothites fled from Gittaim, and they had been sojourners to this day. So we get a lot of information about these guys. We're introduced to basically two of Ishbosheth's top men. They're raiders. Remember, Abner and Joab were raiders. They went out to raid the villages and towns to bring in some income for the troops.
Right.
So they have a very similar role. The primary duties in plundering these towns were to go specifically to towns that were not under the king's protection. And so these were guys that were entrusted to go far distances, get things of great value, and bring them back to the king. So this is kind of this is a significant position. This isn't something you dole out to the guy you don't trust to take on great amounts of responsibility. We're also told that Beroth was counted as part of Benjamin, and that they are of the tribe of Benjamin. So this is Saul's family. Now, the original Beerothites who lived in this area before Israel moved into Canaan, they're not connected to Israel, but we're told in 2 Samuel 21, 1 and 2, again, a little bit of information that's withheld until we need it. We're told that Saul had put the Gibeonites to death. And so what happened was when Saul put the Gibeonites to death, the Beerothites probably fled from their original lands, which was in that same area, and it left the land free for the Benjaminites, the people from the tribe of Benjamin, to live in that area. And so the writer inserts this detail now, because this is what he does. He gives us information as he thinks it's pertinent. He wants us to know that Bana and Rechab's father is referred to as being from Beroth because he lives in that land, not because he's a descendant of that land.
Okay.
And so this means that his sons are also, they're not just Saul's generals or Saul's soldiers, they are part of Saul's family. And so we're supposed to understand it's Saul's family that turns on him, not David, and none of the men under David's command. So the writer's been very careful through this whole story. If you go back to that first episode, or not episode, but chapter, where David encounters Saul and he can kill Saul and chooses not to, the writer has made it very clear David does not want to kill anyone from Saul's family, and this is still continuing.
Right.
Now, verse 4, the writer shifts focus very suddenly, and he's got something he's remembered he needs you to know. So it says in verse 4, Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So really weird that we go from talking about Ishbosheth and all this detailed information about his soldiers. All of a sudden we have this, oh, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on here is we're being reminded Saul has another grandson. There's another descendant, another possible heir to the throne that's there, but we're also being told why he's disqualified.
Mm-hmm.
He can't be a king because he's lame.
Right.
And so because he can't be a king, he poses no threat to Ishbosheth or to David. And it also really drives home the fear of David. The idea that the people were so scared of what he might do that they're willing to go to these extreme lengths to protect Saul's family. Now, I think one of the things that really stands out is the names, Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth. So you've got very similar rhyming Dr. Seuss names. Now, if you look for the names in First Chronicles with all of the genealogies, you aren't going to find these two names. You're actually going to find Ishbaal and Meribaal. So we can look at these names and kind of learn a few things. We know that Bosheth means of shame.
Mm-hmm.
So Ishbosheth is man of shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mephibosheth means destroyer of shame or destroyer of idols.
Okay.
So if we accept these positive readings of Mephibosheth and Ishbosheth, they really stand on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So okay, you got this man of shame, and then you've got the guy who destroys shame. And so a little tip off that we should be looking for something different from Mephibosheth than we should of
Mhm.
Ishbosheth, even though we aren't given any more of Mephibosheth's story at this point in time.
Right.
And so I'm hoping we can get, when we get some further into Mephibosheth's story, we need to get Craig Conaway on to talk about that, because Mephibosheth's kind of his point of focus and emphasis,
Mhm.
and he's got some really good teachings about how we can apply this to our lives. So I like that, because a lot of times we just go through the scripture, and so sometimes having someone remind us this does apply back to us.
Right.
So Rechab and Banag, they go into Ishbosheth's house. This is verse 5, and I'm not reading, I'm just kind of summarizing. And Ishbosheth, he's taking a nap during the day. And when they go into the house, this is verse 6, they pretend to be there to take wheat. And as Ishbosheth's captains or generals or soldiers, they would have received provisions from a royal storehouse. And their presence would have been completely normal. It wouldn't have been out of place for them to be going and saying, we went out and we raided the village, and this is our pay. This is what's due us, so we need to go get it. So verse 7, when they came into the house, as he lay in his room, as in his bedroom, they struck him and put him to death and beheaded him. So little change of events there. And he took his head and went back by the way of Arabah all night. So they immediately go from being just grabbing the grain to let's kill a guy in his bed and let's
Yeah.
take his head. So we'll go ahead and continue with the story, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the details. So they go back, they ride all night, and they get to David's, and they give David his head. And they said, here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, this day on Saul and his offspring. So if you've been reading the whole story from, at least from 2 Samuel 1, this isn't going to end well.
Right.
I mean, you already have a clue as to what's going on. And so David answered, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of the hand of every adversary? When one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news. How much more then, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed, shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? So David immediately rejects the premise. They didn't help. God is the one who's delivered him from every adversary.
Right.
And I love the idea. I've been actually reading and looking at a lot of rejecting the premise of an argument. And, a lot of times if you just reject the premise of somebody's argument, you're halfway out of it and it's halfway done.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the problem is people don't really argue anymore. They argue, but they don't argue for... People no longer really argue for the truth. They argue because they want to feel like they're right.
they want to hear their words coming out of your mouth.
Yeah. They don't. Yeah, exactly. They don't want the truth. They don't want anyone else's opinion. Yeah, they want agreement, and as we've mentioned many times, agreement often stops the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so
we're having those differing ideas, and to talk through them, you can actually find what the right idea or the right course of action is, because wisdom is found in a multitude of counselors. I think I read that in a book somewhere. So yeah, but this story, I mean, obviously we're reminded of the Amalekite who comes with news of Saul's death. The Amalekite that either lied or he actually did kill Saul.
Right.
And, the Amalekite at least killed Saul on the battlefield, and then he brought proof of Saul's death with the head, with the crown and the armlet. And David has seen what Manna and Rechab did as worse. They went into Ishbosheth's house, and he's in bed sleeping, and so the fact that they would desecrate his body to bring proof.
Mm-hmm.
David is appalled, and he even refers to Ishbosheth as a Zedek, which is righteous. He's a righteous man. He's a good man. You don't mess with this guy. This is a title that's applied to Noah. It's a title that was used to describe men worth saving Sodom over.
Right.
Were there that many Zedeks in the city? It's applied to God himself in Exodus 9:27, and it's a title Saul used of David. So to call someone a Zedek is a very high compliment. And notice David doesn't call Ishbosheth the Lord's anointed. That's been rescinded.
Mm,
He
mhm.
did tell the Amalekite, who are you to stretch out your hand against the Lord's anointed? But Ishbosheth is worthy to live just because he's righteous.
Mhm.
And, he hasn't, when you look at Ishbosheth's story, he hasn't done much. There's not really a whole lot to commend him for. I read one commentary and I couldn't find it, but it's like Ishbosheth is remembered for three things: being made king, ruling in Israel, and dying to go to his fathers. It's like
Yeah.
these are the only three things we know about this guy. And so we also have the shared theme with Joab's murder of Abner, striking down a man through deception and trickery. It's not honorable. And I almost get the sense from what David says, if this had been an honest challenge, that he would have been fine. But the fact that it is so underhanded, this is what bugs him. So verse 12. And David commanded his young men, and they killed him and cut off their hands and feet and hung them beside the pool of Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So, fully excusable crime, executable crime under the Torah. We have two witnesses. The two guys testified
That they did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
They told on
And
themselves.
exactly. Whereas with the Amalekite, we had that issue that we had to work through, whether or not his confession was sufficient to condemn him to death. Now, what isn't supported by the Torah is the mutilation of the body. And if we read this passage in isolation and with our preconceived notions, it's a really confusing passage
Mhm.
because David's a hero. He's a man after God's own heart, and he is the anointed one. And all of these very true statements about David in our minds often translate into David was perfect. And David's not perfect. He's still very much fully human. And he's a product of his culture. Now, he's one who's making radical changes within his kingdom and culture, and he's taking great steps to bring the kingdom into alignment with what God wants, and he has some prophetic moments where he gets great insight,
Mhm.
but he's still just a human who's fighting to overcome the environment that shaped him. And we shouldn't forget that it wasn't that long ago that when he faced Nabal, one of the things we had to question about David was how much had he been influenced by his time in Saul's house? And this is Saul's relatives who have done this to Ishbosheth.
Mhm.
So if we zoom out any further, we have to remember that the men he ruled were products of their culture. And these men are men that Nabal, they described them as Nabal described them as terrorists.
Right.
So, I mean, these are not, your proper church guy in his nice little suit and his, I had too many helpings of peach cobbler at the potluck guy. This is a warrior. And, Israel's become every bit as violent as the nations that surrounded them and oppressed them. This
Mhm.
is why God wanted them to drive the Canaanites out. Because if you remember, you got to go all the way back to Judges 1. It was when Israel stopped driving them out and killing the people they were supposed to kill, and they started taking them as prisoners, that all of a sudden they start doing the things that the Canaanites had
Mhm.
been doing to their prisoners. What the king there was Adonai-Bezek, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And, this king's view was basically, well, I've done it to a lot of other kings, so I guess it's my turn. And it was so normal. He didn't even have he wasn't even upset enough about it to be distraught over his own faith. It was just something that happened. And now Israel is beheading kings.
Mhm.
So we have to have some kind of return to who Israel is supposed to be as a nation, because Saul had fostered and embodied brutality in his reign. I mean, he ruled through violence and intimidation. And so he was very much the king like all other kings.
Mm-hmm.
He was that guy. And during the years of his reign, this was something he would have fostered within the nation of Israel. So even if the nation hadn't picked it up from the other nations that were surrounding them, now Saul has made it a part of their culture.
Mm-hmm.
So David's having to overcome that. And we need to remember David lived in Saul's house.
Yep.
So David still has to get rid of these mindsets himself. And when we remember that, again, we keep going back, and this is why it's so important to read all the stuff in context and to go through, because you see how this builds.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just something that happened because somebody flipped a switch. We're talking decades of conditioning. But when we go back to 1 Samuel, in the first part of it, Eli had to be removed because Eli had brought those seeds of Egypt into Israel with him, and they were being manifest through his son. And so removing corrupt leadership, even Israel's corrupt leadership, is a brutal and bloody process. And, that's got some major implications when we want to talk about fast forwarding to Jesus and Jesus becoming king over the world and manifest through his life, death, and resurrection. That was a bloody, brutal process. The difference was, instead of it being taken out on the troops, he took it on himself.
Right.
And so, when we look at David's reign, we can see these parallels, and we never want to overreach. But at the same time, David is set up as one of the examples of what we should be looking for when we're looking for that returning Messiah. And this makes it so much more easy to understand why the Jews missed Jesus as the Messiah when he arrived, because he didn't look like David.
Right.
And so we have to use some care and some discernment as we go through here and trying to figure out how far we take these examples. But I do think that the idea that corrupt leadership, it gets entrenched.
Mm-hmm.
And
it absolutely does.
People love corrupt leadership, whether or not they want to say so. As long as corrupt leadership isn't impacting them personally, they adore it. And we can look at this throughout history, and I won't go into a history lesson, but because corrupt leadership, whether we like it or not, it's highly effective. It gets the job done because it doesn't care about the rules.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just like political leadership; it's also cultural leadership. I mean, you look at Hollywood, and again, we can, I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories going on there, but there is that glamour lifestyle associated with it that often tends to be immoral. And so that's, that's something that
maybe we need to do a Patreon special on that.
Maybe we should, but but I'm just saying, we see that where it's not, it's like I'm just going to do whatever I want, and you're right. I mean, I hadn't considered it as in we adore corrupt leadership, but it makes sense whenever you slow down and think about it.
Occasionally my brain kicks over at these little things that I pop out, and it's like, is that right? And then I have to stop and look and process through and figure out if I'm even right in my own thoughts.
Sure.
But, the big point and the big takeaway is David's trying to establish a kingdom that's operating in direct defiance to the morals and ethics of his day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard. I mean, anytime somebody tries to change the very fabric of society, which is what you do when you're changing morals and ethics, that's a painful process for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say that, we really need to consider the depth of what David's doing. This is a king who can grieve over the death of an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
He's done it twice now. He's done it actually with the death of Ishbosheth. We're now up to the third time. This is a kingdom where where a woman could counsel and guide God's anointed, with Abigail coming out and talking to David and going, "Hey, you need to cool it before you make a mistake."
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine Saul receiving the words of a woman saying, "Dude, you need to calm down"? I mean, he probably would have just stabbed her too. This is a place where compassion can be extended to even those who did wrong, and people could find a forgiveness. You didn't find these things in Saul's kingdom. And so, he still has a lot of work to do, and he's going to make some mistakes, but we see the groundwork for what we should expect being laid, these expectations being put in place for the entire nation. And so when people in Jesus' time, when they're looking for David, they're looking for, equality in the kingdom. They're looking for grace. They're looking for a king who can do all of these things that David did that were so counter to the Canaanite culture because they were living under Roman occupation. So when David kills Bana and Rechab, he's doing it as a warning. He's saying, if you continue to act like Canaanites, you're going to be treated like a Canaanite. And you need to understand, these are not the rules I want to inflict on my nation, but don't make me. He's not scared to stand up to it. And so, if life is going to be honored in his nation, then when a life is taken, then another life has to be given as a recompense. This is part of Torah law. This goes back to Noah coming off the ark. You do not spill the blood of humanity, because when you spill the blood of humanity, now you have to give your life too.
Right.
And so this is part of the law. And I know there's a lot of debate about whether Christians should support the death penalty today. The death penalty today is not the same. And I'm not talking about whether we should support it or not. That's a political decision I'm not going to get into. But what I can say is, at this point in time, there are no prisons.
Right.
You don't have a place to hold people who might pose a threat to your society. And food was at a premium for everyone. So there is a distinct difference. So the idea of killing someone who posed a threat, and that's what we're talking about when we're killing murderers, someone who can harm someone else and desires to harm someone else, they had to be stopped for the good of society. And there weren't many other options than death. So, we need to be careful to judge the rules and the actions of what happens in the Bible by the standards of its time, not our own. So, but in David's kingdom, what we're doing is death begets death, is basically what's being said. And it's being, this power is being wielded because, yes, death begets death, but it's so that the righteous can live.
Right.
Because these murderers had killed a righteous man. They killed a Zedek. And so when David, though, what we find is this contrast, because even when death was politically advantageous for him, he refused to go there. So he provides that contrast where these guys who'd killed for political advancement, and David said, no, I don't even do this.
Right.
And David's the one with the right to carry it out. And so if David, God's chosen and God's anointed, the one who's God has said is going to rule over all of Israel, refuses to make the step to take his place, then nobody else has the right to step up and do it on his behalf, which that may actually play into a really interesting teaching on Christianity and how we practice our faith. What rights, how far do we have,
How far should we go in trying to accomplish what we think God wants to
There
get
you
done?
go.
Is that kind of where we're going? Okay.
That was exactly what I was thinking. I just couldn't get the words in the proper
Yeah,
order.
who's the person who's in charge, and how much are they actually in charge of?
Exactly. So, if David's willing to sit and wait, we can sit and wait. So, David buries the head of Ishbosheth with Abner's body in Hebron. Now, this could be some very pleasing symmetry that the crowned head was buried with the one who made him king. It could be some pretty poetry where Abner, who watched over Ishbosheth, is watching over Ishbosheth in death. It could be a little sardonic humor that Abner's figurehead is buried with him. But, I think from David's words, probably what we're looking at is David is honoring Abner and Ishbosheth by burying them with their fathers,
Yeah,
by burying them
that's what I
together.
gathered. It was just, I assumed it would have just been expected. I
Well,
mean, if you're trying to honor those people at all, just put them in the family tomb. That's where they belong.
well, and that's the thing. In many ways, Abner was probably more of a father to Ishbosheth than Saul ever was. I
Sure.
mean, we never hear of Ishbosheth during Saul's reign. And whenever he does emerge, his name is so connected with Abner's that the two are almost inseparable. And this leads us to the point where now everybody from Saul's house who could have posed a threat to David's reign or stood between David and the throne, they're all gone. And the writer presents this as Ishbosheth died, and then all of the events recorded in the rest of chapter 4 and 5, I mean, they just happen with consecutive momentum and they just keep rolling forward.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's an issue as there's a 5.5 year period where Ishbosheth isn't reigning and David is still king in Hebron, and he's not king over Israel. So there's some debate on how the timeline plays out, because David ruled 7.5 years in Hebron, Ishbosheth ruled 2 years in the rest of Israel, and so there's 5.5 years. We don't know if Ishbosheth died, if it took
At the beginning of that 7, at the end of the 7,
exactly.
where, yeah.
Exactly. And so, your two options is that, the Israelites said, hey, we already had a deal in place. David was going to be king over all of us, even if Ishbosheth had lived. So let's just make the move. Or there could have been some time where they went, hey, David's out to kill anyone who belongs to the house of Saul, and we're tribal members in Benjamin. We need to wait and really weigh his options. So there could have been some time where, Ishbosheth's subjects needed to learn how to trust David, because it would have been very normal for a king to go in and kill everyone who had been loyal to this other king. So if we read it as David is the logical next choice, and then it becomes just a done deal that he becomes king. But by the customs of that day, David, like I said, he would have killed everyone, and it would have taken a while if you just kind of go by trying to put yourself in that situation. But again, the Bible isn't very clear. So we also have another problem with this, in that the chronology of the next few chapters don't match up exactly with the chronology of Chronicles.
Sure.
Because Chronicles overlaps a lot with the book of Samuel, and this is where it's getting fun to do research, because I've got like 20 books, because I've got my commentaries on Samuel, my commentaries on Chronicles, my commentaries on Saul, because now we're starting to see all of these books overlap and how they're going to interplay, and I want to bring that in as much as possible, because I think this is going to help some people with objections that they have to contradictions in the Bible, and to see where the Bible might say one thing in one book and another in Samuel, one in Samuel, one in Chronicles, and how they actually work together. So our basic outline is we have David anointed in both books. So good so far. David conquers Jerusalem, so still going great. But in 1 Samuel, then we move to Hiram of Tyre. He's going to build David a house.
Okay.
But in Chronicles, we have this list about David's mighty men and the names of who they are and where they're from, which is really interesting. So we'll talk about that, because we don't have that in Samuel. Then we also have, after the mighty men in Chronicles, the ark is brought from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, it's moved. But the problem is, this is when Uzzah dies in Chronicles.
Okay.
Meanwhile, in 1 Samuel, David is just having more kids.
Okay.
And then we have David's defeat of the Philistines. And when Uzzah dies in Chronicles, then we have David having more kids, and then the Philistines. And then finally the ark makes it to Chronicles. But David in 1 Samuel it's the story of the ark is all one narrative. You don't get that break between Uzzah dying and the final successful leg of the journey to get the ark into Jerusalem.
Okay.
And so Samuel makes it more of a point to give you this kind of sweeping saga where David rises to power and everything he's doing is going well before he introduces this failure in moving the ark. And the writer of First Chronicles kind of gives you this interwoven picture of how all of these things are happening simultaneously in David's life. And in some ways, I actually find if we're looking for historical accuracy
Yeah.
as what was going on, I would think that the writer of Chronicles was actually probably being more true to the actual timeline. Because, I mean, how many of us in our lives have one thing happening?
Right.
Usually there's this interplay between 20 different things.
Well, and it's like Maxie Birch in one of his lectures was talking about, when we study history, we get the luxury of being able to study one thing in history.
Mm-hmm.
And where, again, the people live life like we do. They have everything's going on. They're fighting wars. They're
having kids.
They're doing political things. They're, it's just everything
trying
all
to be
at
involved in
once.
church.
Yeah, that's a lot of what it is. And so it very much is the way we experience life is much how the ancients experienced life, just with different technology.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, now when a lot of people critique this, and this is one thing that I always think it's funny how people who critique quote unquote contradictions in the Bible, they always want to make a really big deal. Aha, I found it. I got you. This is why you can't trust your book. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that largely the church brought that on themselves with a lot of over-the-top rhetoric about how there are not any errors in the Bible. And I know we've mentioned it before, but it's just, we have to, I mean, I think that's worth repeating is because people do forget a lot of the things that, a lot of the guns that the church gets shot with, we hand it over to people.
Pretty much.
I mean, if you want to have an analogy, I guess.
Honestly, when someone says, the Bible's inerrant, I basically go, you've never done any translation work. I mean, that's kind of where I land on things. So, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust the Bible because, oh my gosh, there's errors. The content, what's presented within it is still reliable because even with this discrepancy between Second Samuel and First Chronicles, the timeline's different. But it's just the way this guy has chosen to tell the story.
Right.
And it's the information where it does overlap is almost identical.
Yeah.
And by and large, it's so identical that most commentators believe that whoever wrote First Chronicles actually had a copy of Second Samuel to look at.
Okay.
And so we're going to be looking at where the writer of Chronicles actually decides to change some stuff and to omit some stuff and add a few details. And we're going to talk about why that's important. And there is some importance there because Samuel's trying to argue one point. And so he doesn't always give you the information that has to do with the point that the writer of First Chronicles making.
Right.
And, anybody who's had kids, when I explain something to my older daughter, I didn't always tell her the same thing that I told my younger daughter.
Sure.
Because the things that matter to my older daughter often didn't apply to my younger daughter or vice versa. And so that's why we need to take into account who the audience was. And there is a major difference between the audience of Samuel and the audience of Chronicles. So we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about those as we come to them. But however, whatever amount of time has passed between the death of Ishbosheth and David becoming king, the writers of Chronicles and Samuel both agree on the substance of what follows. And that's the important part. So we're going to move into chapter 5, verse 1. It says, then all the tribes of Israel came to David, not plural there,
All of Israel's tribes.
Yeah,
You're trying to do the possessive on both ends.
yeah. It's been the allergy season is still attacking, guys, and it is brutal. But anyway, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." So all the tribes, for the first time in 7.5 years, the nation is starting to unify, and David is sought out to become their king. So this is going into the third time David is going to be proclaimed king. First time was with Samuel and his brothers. Second time was with the tribe of Judah. And now we have him over all of the tribe of Israel. And it's interesting that we have this progression from where he's anointed king with his actual biological flesh and blood brothers who basically wanted to ignore him. And now he's being proclaimed the flesh and blood of a people who've sought him out to be their king. So you see this total reversal in that.
Right.
Saul was declared king 3 times. The first time with Samuel, and then again at Mizpah when they drew the lots and Saul was among the baggage. And then there's a public acclamation of his kingship after his defeat of the Ammonites. So each time we have this 3. Now Saul earns the approval of the people, and the people who demanded that, that those who had doubts that Saul should lead. I mean, you go think back. I know this has been several episodes ago. They basically said, that Saul shouldn't lead. So the people who now agree that Saul should be king, they wanted to kill them. And Saul actually refused to kill anyone who doubted his right to lead because God has worked salvation of Israel. Now, David is proclaimed king not after a successful battle, but rather he's been declared king because he says God has worked salvation in his life. God had delivered him from his adversaries. And he demonstrates this truth not in battle and not in fighting, but actually in his refusal to fight. So it's this kind of weird reversal where Saul had to earn the acceptance of the people by winning this battle. David actually, it's in refusing that isn't that crazy? Because he had 3 different guys he could have gone up again. He could have gone up against Saul. He could have gone up against Abner, and he could have gone up against Ishbosheth. And those 3 times he didn't. So there's a lot of play with the number 3 there, but also these interplays where you see how David is already proving himself to be different from Saul, again, just by what he refuses to do. So verse 2, and this is still the people talking. It says, "In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So the people cite those times. They remember when David was Saul's general. They remember that he had led troops out into battle and he had brought them back in. And what they're saying is, you took us out, but not only did you take us out to battle, you were such a good commander, you could bring us home from that battle.
Right.
And I think we kind of miss the fact that there is this element that the people are acknowledging David's skill because we aren't familiar with this kind of, with this idiom that would have been used. So a general who can bring you home from battle is a million times better than one who can just take you out into battle. And I could take anybody out into battle right now. Follow me. We're probably going to get killed, but
right. Yeah, taking an army into war is easy.
Exactly. So
getting them out, not so much.
Yeah, and to the fact that the people remember this, and this is why they think it's good, it is really interesting. But they also cite a prophecy, and we haven't heard this prophecy. We're so used to thinking of David as the shepherd king, as the one who, with all that shepherdry imagery.
Shepherd imagery?
Yeah, whatever. Okay, I make up words when I like to make up words. And so anyway.
It's not helpful.
Sometimes it is. It's not often, but anyway.
Not in this moment.
So, but we do. We think of David as being that shepherd, and we think, Psalms 23, all of that comes to mind. But I didn't even realize we have never heard David referred to as a shepherd until we get to this verse. And now all of a sudden the people are saying, hey, God said you're going to be our shepherd.
Hmm.
So they're citing a prophecy that has not been recorded. So this means the talk around Israel and the things that are being said about David, we don't even have all of it.
Interesting.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, uh, verse 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all Israel.
Yeah. Well, one more point, real quick,
Okay.
on the hearing about stuff that's not been recorded. It's like, are the people who are critical about the stuff, have they never lost a slip of paper? I mean, it's not like it's every piece of paper is always well preserved and accessible and cataloged.
Well, I often think too.
Or a whole book. I've lost whole books.
Oh yeah, I mean
Very frustrating.
that. Yeah, and when you tear the entire place apart, I know I had a copy of. And the flip side's true too, because there's this really weird um, ideology that's out there that just it cracks me up, where anything that's old and written down must be true.
Right.
Like every person who lived in 2000 or 2000 years ago was somehow inherently trustworthy.
Right.
I don't even understand that mindset. And I would often talk to my students when I was teaching, and I'm like, if somebody went forward in time, 3 or 4 thousand years, and they look back and they started unearthing documents that we had from this time period, and would some of the internet sources
Hmm.
be considered, oh, look at their history, look at how crazy they were, look at what they believed,
Yeah.
or
Ancient tabloids.
yeah, I mean, it just it doesn't work. So, basically anything that's true of us as a race today is true of people back then.
Yeah.
And so you got to, use some common sense. But yeah, so basically they get together and they back to our Bible stuff. They make this covenant, and we're not told what's in the covenant. We just have some speculation, but one of the things that the sages believed was in this covenant was David agreeing, "Hey, you're not going to kill us,"
Right.
which makes a lot of sense in the context of that time.
It's helpful to, not kill people you're in covenant with.
Yeah, so at the very least, it was implied. I don't think we can get around the idea that they probably did need some reassurance. So verse 4, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. So now we know David dies when he's 70. So we got a nice little
Mhm.
timeline there. And this is the typical formulaic pronouncement concerning the reign of kings. We're going to see this over and over again as we go forward. It also tells us that 10 to 12 years have passed since David was first anointed. Because, we talked about when Samuel goes to David, and why isn't he out fighting with his brothers, and he was probably too young to be part of the army. And so this is probably the reason why he was there. So if he's 30 at this point in time and he was too young, he's 18 to 20 years old probably. And so 10 to 12 years. I mean, most of us can't wait 5 minutes for God to answer a prayer before we start taking matters into our own hand. And yet here David has been willing to wait, and he's gone out of his way to wait, and he's punished people who started getting ahead of him and trying to reclaim the throne for him. So, anyhow, so the next verse 5, it offers some math even I know doesn't work. So, we can offer some possible solutions. So let's just read what it has to say, and then we'll talk about it. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. So literally, verse 5 tells us David reigns 40 and a half years, not 40 years. So we have two explanations. One, that David was not empowered during the 6 months that Absalom, his son, rebels against him. We're going to get there, but there's 6 months that Absalom has, quote unquote, the throne. So the 40 and a half would be the overarching time, but there were 6 months in there that he was out of power, so that's not included. The second is that he reigned 32 and a half years in in Jerusalem, but it's rounded up to 33 out of respect for the greatness of Israel. Yeah. And so, in all probability, it probably just is the Hebrew tradition of going with the closest round number.
I mean, it makes sense to me.
It's the idiom of the time, but these are the things that are held up as reasons not to believe the Bible. So when you hear the Bible's full of contradiction and people making a stink about it, actually have them tell you what they're talking about, because this is the kind of thing a lot of them are referring to.
Right.
And then you have to ask, is this really something that I'm supposed to be upset about? And the other question you have to ask, would an ancient reader see this as a contradiction?
Right.
Because a Hebrew person reading this would just say, oh, this is how we talk. This is how our people explain things. What's wrong with you? Why are you making a big deal out of it?
And so far, we've covered a lot of, apparent contradictions in the Bible. None of them have an outlandish explanation.
Right?
So, granted, we haven't done every single one, but
we haven't avoided the ones we've come across.
Exactly.
And, my faith hasn't been shaken by this. So, now the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you want to look this up, this is 4Q, and I forget, the 4Q Samuel is the scroll it's on. First Chronicles, if you go to First Chronicles 11 and verse 3, which talks about the same area, and if you read Josephus, it actually omits all three of those accounts of this incident, omit verses 4 and 5, because they don't want to include the contradictory evidence, because that's how scrupulous the scribes and the rabbis were about making sure the stories did flow and they were correct, because believe it or not, the Bible had editors.
Right.
And so, and maybe at some point we'll talk about evidence of that. But so we do have, like I said, 4 different accounts of the same incident,
mm-hmm.
and 4 separate accounts. And a lot of people want to get hung up on the fact, well, verses 4 and 5 are missing from these other 3 accounts, and we only have one with verses 4 and 5. That's missing the forest for the trees, because we have the greater story in all 4 accounts. Yes, this little bit of math is left out, but the content of the story is present. And I think we should be so excited that we have 4 accounts of the same story that are so close together.
Yeah.
That, wow, this is something we should be paying attention to. So anyway, that's my little rabbit trail. So verse 6, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking David cannot come in here. So this is a weird verse. And man, this is where we start getting into some background of things. And so we're going to talk about who the Jebusites were real quick. There's 3 theories about who the Jebusites were. One is that these are the historic inhabitants of Jebus, the city. So hence called the Jebusites. Makes sense. The second possibility is that they're Philistines who have taken up residence in the city of Jebus,
Okay.
in which we know that the Philistines are living in the towns of Israel. And we know that people are often referred to by where they live, not necessarily by ancestry. So that does kind of work. A third possibility is they're Hittites, who are now called Jebusites because they had taken up residence in the city of Jebus even before the Philistines had moved in. And so we're going to have to spend some time talking about what we know about the inhabitants of Jebus, because Jebus is the city of Jerusalem. And as anyone who knows their Bible, Jerusalem's going to play a central role in all of the things that happen from here on out. And we do have some grace in the fact that we have mentions of Jerusalem apart from the Bible. So we have some other information we can bring in, which the Amarna tablets, which were about 1500 BC, so not too far off from this time, actually. These were letters that were written to Pharaoh from overseers that he'd placed in the conquered lands of Canaan whenever the Egyptians were over Canaan as a whole. And the language of these tablets, surprisingly, it's not Egyptian, but it's Akkadian, and that's a cuneiform. So if y'all guys have ever seen that, that's what Akkadian looks like. And it's got some Canaanite words and phrases tossed in to this Akkadian document to an Egyptian pharaoh. So, it's a lot of fun for translators to kind of filter through. Now, I say document, it's actually a collection of documents. It spans 30 years.
Right.
There's 382 of them in total. So this is a significant bit of information about this time period and about the geography and the people. And there's evidence that before the Egyptians took over Jebus, that it was there was a strong Babylonian influence. So if Babylon had not directly conquered it, there were Babylonians who were living there and were influencing the architecture and all that good stuff. And that is most notably evidenced in a temple that we can find there to Ninib, is what I've got on my notes. Let's hope that's right. And so, but we're going to talk about, when we come back, we're going to talk about what the Bible has to tell us about this city.
Okay.
And because it really is, it's a fascinating city, because not only does it play a crucial role within the Bible, it is a crucial city for so many religions. And which is kind of odd that so many religions have said, this is our city and this is the center of what we believe. And Christianity and Judaism is no different. So we'll leave it with that little bit of a cliffhanger and why David needed to conquer this particular place.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. Well, I hope everyone out there is enjoying the conversation. If you are, let us know. Raven Creek SC on all the social media.
Microphone attacked.
Yeah. RavenCreekSC.com will get you to this show and hopefully some show notes in the future.
I'm getting there, guys. We're working on solutions. I promise.
So, but yeah, be part of the conversation. Hit us up. And between now and then, I guess we will see you on the internet. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.